In the spring of 1989, in a low-ceilinged meeting room above the feed store in Maddox Ridge, a co-op agronomist with clean hands and a good education told a 58-year-old orchardist that his trees were a liability the whole cooperative could no longer carry. He said it kindly. He called the man Silas. Then he called the orchard a museum, and the room of growers, most of them in debt to the same lender, did not argue with him. 23 years later, in the autumn of 2012, a federal plant pathologist stood at the edge of that same orchard with a clipboard she would not need and said a single sentence into a recorder, and the number that followed it traveled up and down the ridge faster than any rumor the county had ever carried. This is the story of the years between those two rooms and of a man who would not do the one simple thing everyone agreed he should do. Let me tell you about Silas Hovland, because the whole thing turns on the kind of man he was, and he was a difficult man to flatter. He was known on the ridge for two things. The first was that he could read a tree the way other men read weather, could walk a row in February and tell you which trunk was lying about its health by the color under a thumbnail of scraped bark. The second was that he almost never changed his mind once he had walked the ground himself, which his neighbors called stubbornness and his late father had called the only thing worth inheriting. He was not a large man. He was wiry and sun-cured, with hands that had been broken and reset by 40 winters of pruning, the left thumb knocked permanently sideways by a ladder fall in 1971. And he wore the same brown canvas coat so long that the co-op men joked it had been grafted on. His orchard sat on the high shoulder of Brindle County, 1,100 feet up, where the air drained cold at night, and the apples colored early. His grandfather had set the oldest trees in 1911, and Silas could name every one of the old cultivars the way a shepherd names a flock. There were northern spies that bore only every other year and bore like a confession when they did. There were russeted Roxbury apples the color of a saddle, and a knotted old Esopus Spitzenberg that Thomas Jefferson was said to have favored, and a dozen seedling trees nobody had a name for, trees his grandfather had simply liked the look of and let stand. 41 distinct kinds of apple grew on those 40 acres. Most of them no grocer wanted. All of them, Silas would tell you, were holding the ground together in ways the ledger could not see. The ledger could see something else, and that is where the trouble started. And the trouble had a face and a clipboard, and a sincere belief that he was helping. The Brindle Ridge Growers Cooperative had hired itself a new orchard program director the winter before, a man named Phelan Cardew. You should not picture a villain. Cardew was 46, lean and pressed and genuinely brilliant, a doctor of pomology out of a land-grant college downstate, and he had come north with a plan that was, on paper, entirely sound. He had run the numbers on every member orchard. He had built a model on a portable computer he carried in a hard case and set up on tables in feed stores all across the county. And the model said plainly and without malice that the future of apples on the ridge was a single high-value cultivar, planted dense on dwarfing rootstock, picked early, and shipped uniform to a regional grocery chain that wanted 10,000 identical red apples and not one strange russeted thing it could not put a sticker on. Cardew was not wrong about the market. That is the part people forget when they tell this story now. He was right about the market for almost 20 years, and a man who is right for 20 years earns the confidence he carries into the 21st. The cultivar the co-op chose was a bright, sweet, early-coloring apple that the chain buyer loved, grafted onto a rootstock called M9, a dwarfing stock that let a grower plant 1,000 small trees an acre instead of 100 big ones. Here is what dwarfing rootstock is, plainly, because the whole reversal lives inside it, and you should understand the mechanism, not just the result. An apple tree is almost always two trees. The top, the part that bears the fruit you eat, is grafted onto the root of a different tree, chosen for its size and vigor, the join sealed with wax and wrapped, the scar of it visible at the base of every grafted trunk for the life of the tree. M9 makes a small, early productive tree, and small, early productive trees are wonderful arithmetic. They are also, every one of them, genetically identical. The same clone repeated 1,000 times an acre and 10,000 times across a ridge. And a thing that is one thing has only one. Silas knew this the way he knew the cold drained off his high shoulder at night. He did not have the word for it that Cardew had. He had something older he had watched. So in that spring meeting in 1989, when Cardew laid out the conversion plan and the lender's representative nodded along, and the chain buyer's letter of intent was passed hand to hand around the room like a sacrament, Silas Hovland said one sentence and then he said no. The sentence was this. He said, a hand flat on the table. You are planting one apple, and one apple is a held breath. Cardew smiled. It was not a cruel smile. He had heard this kind of thing from old growers his whole career, and he had been right, and they had been wrong, often enough to have earned the smile. He set his stylus down on the table beside the glowing screen and folded his hands. He said, Silas, nobody is asking you to stop loving your trees. We're asking you to stop letting 40 acres of inoculum sit up there at the head of the drainage where every spore you grow blows down onto the rest of us. That word, inoculum, was the wound, though it took years to bleed. What Cardew meant was real and not unreasonable. An old mixed orchard, unsprayed in the places Silas let go wild, carries diseases. Some of those diseases blow downhill. The co-op's new uniform planting would be, by design, a monoculture, and a monoculture is only as safe as the cleanliness of everything around it. Cardew's model treated Silas's 40 acres as a reservoir of risk sitting upwind of $40 million of planned investment. He asked Silas to plow the old orchard under, not to sell it, to destroy it, root, and graft, so that the ridge could be made, clean and uniform and safe. He asked twice that spring. The first time was in the meeting, and the room was witness to it. The second time he drove up the ridge himself a week later and found Silas on a ladder in the oldest row, and he stood at the base of the ladder with the morning sun raking across the trees and made his case again, reasonably, a fair man asking a fair thing. He brought a cost-share form that would have paid Silas a good price per acre to do the bulldozing, federal money the kind a man behind. On a note does not turn down lightly, he held it up so Silas could see it from the ladder. Silas came down rung by rung, wiped his good hand on his coat, took the form and looked at it for a long moment. Then he folded it in half, then in quarters, and put it in his coat pocket. That night he fed it to the wood stove without reading the figure on it, and his wife, Merritt, watched him do it from the kitchen doorway and said only, "You're sure?" And it was not a question, and he did not answer it. And that was the whole conversation. They had been married 31 years and ran most of their hardest decisions through about that many words. What it cost him to say no was the real story for a long time, longer than anyone watching would have believed, and the cost came due slowly, the way the worst bills always do. The co-op did not throw him out. They could not by their own bylaws, and Cardew would not have wanted them to. Membership in the cooperative, though, was how a ridge grower reached the market. The co-op owned the cold storage, the grader, the trucks, the contract with the chain. A man outside it sold apples off a tailgate to whoever drove by. So, when Silas refused the conversion, the co-op did the rational, bloodless thing the model recommended. They reclassified his fruit as ungraded. They stopped sending the truck up the ridge to pick up his bins. They priced his cold storage at the non-member rate, which was to say at a rate built to make the point. None of it was cruelty. All of it was arithmetic. And the arithmetic was killing him by inches. A few $100s a quarter, at first, then more as the chain contract grew, and the member price dropped further below what a man outside could get. His neighbor down the ridge, a younger man named Royce Tannehill, converted his whole 60 acres that first year. You should hold on to Royce because his path runs alongside Silas's the whole way down, and where it ends is the second half of the verdict. Royce was 34, ambitious, decent, and badly in love with the future Cardew had drawn. He borrowed against everything to put in the dense M9 planting. He pulled out his father's old standard trees with a chain and a tractor in a single brutal week in March, dragging the great root balls up out of the ground, one after another, and he burned the brush in a pile behind his barn that smoked for 3 days, and that you could see from the edge of town. Silas saw the smoke from his high shoulder and did not say anything about it. Not to Royce and not to Merritt. By Royce's third autumn, his young trees were bearing, bright and uniform and early, exactly as promised, and the chain buyer paid him on time, and the co-op named him to its board. For a long stretch of years, Royce Tannehill was the living proof that Cardew was right, and Silas was a sentimental old man clinging to a museum at the top of the hill. How Silas survived those years is the teaching part of this story, the part that matters more than the reveal at the end, and it began with him going small and going sideways. Cut off from the co-op's market for fresh fruit, he stopped trying to sell apples by the bushel and started selling what only his strange old orchard could make. The russeted Roxbury that no grocer wanted, ugly as a potato and twice as homely, turned out to make a hard cider of such depth that a cider maker 2 counties over would drive up the ridge every October to buy the whole crop of them by the ton. The man's name was Castellan, and he would stand in the orchard turning a russet over in his hands like a jeweler. And he told Silas once that the bright early apple the co-op grew made a cider like sugar water, and that these homely things made a cider you could stand a spoon in. The biennial Northern spies, useless for a uniform pack but unmatched in a pie, found a bakery in the city that paid a premium for a tartness the bright early apple simply did not have, and the baker, a heavy, patient woman who came up twice a season, taught Silas more about what a flavor was worth than the co-op ever had. He learned to graft cyanwood, the pencil-thick cuttings of his rare old varieties, taking them in the dormant cold of January and storing them in damp sawdust in the cellar, and he sold those cuttings by mail to a slow trickle of home growers and small nurseries who wanted apples the catalogs had stopped listing. None of it made him rich. All of it kept the lights on and the note paid barely, by the kind of margin that does not show up in a co-op model because the model was not built to see it. And he kept doing the thing that would later look like prophecy and was, at the time, simply how he had always farmed. He kept his orchard diverse on purpose. He let a strip of wild understory grow between the rows, goldenrod and aster and red clover, and a tangle of grasses he never mowed past June. And he did not understand it as habitat the way an entomologist would have. He understood that his grandfather had done it, and that the rows where it grew had fewer bad years. He kept the 41 varieties, even when keeping the worthless ones cost him a day's pruning for a bushel of fruit nobody would buy, because a tree that bore badly in one year often bore the year another tree failed, and a man 1,100 feet up the cold shoulder of a ridge. The year the doubt nearly won was 1997, and every true vindication has a year like it, the year the patient man almost stops being patient. Merritt got sick that winter, a thing in her blood that the doctors in the county could not treat, and the doctors in the city could for a price, and the price was not small. The medicine came in glass vials that cost more than a week's cider, and the trips to the city cost the gas and the days. The bank that held the note on the orchard sent a man up the ridge in a clean gray car to talk about the orchard's appraised value, and the man was polite, and he sat at the kitchen table and turned his coffee cup in a slow circle and pointed out, accurately, that the land would appraise for 3 times as much if it were cleared and converted. That the standing old trees were, in the bank's exact written words, an encumbrance on the collateral. He said the word encumbrance, the way Cardew had said inoculum, a clean technical word for a living thing, and Silas heard the echo of it and said nothing. Royce Tannehill, board member, now and prosperous, came up himself a few days later to say what the co-op could not put in a letter. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and his good boots clean and told Silas there was no shame in it, that times had changed, that the offer to buy in and convert was still open, and the co-op would even forgive the back storage fees that had piled up over 8 years. He laid it out gently, the way you lay out a kindness, the buy-in cost, the conversion timeline, the price the chain was paying that very season. He meant every word of it well. He had watched his own gamble pay off, watched his trees bear and his board seat come, and his father's old debt vanish, and he could not see the orchard as anything but the thing standing between an old friend and solvency. "You'd clear 40,000 the first year you converted," Royce said. "I did the math twice. I can show you on Cardew's machine." Silas listened. He poured the man more coffee. Then he walked Royce out the back door and across the wet march ground to the oldest row, to the gnarled Isopus Spitzenberg his grandfather had set in 1911, a tree with a trunk like a clenched fist and bark the gray of old iron, and he put his good hand flat on it. "Royce," he said, "this tree has lived through 4 blights. I know the names of, and 2 I don't. It outlived my grandfather and my father, and it will outlive me. It's still here. Ask yourself why." Royce looked at the tree for a while, and he did not have an answer he liked, and the cold came up through his clean boots, and after a time he put his hat back on and drove down the hill. The conversion did not happen. Merritt got well slowly, the medicine working, the city growing familiar, and then unnecessary. The note got paid that quarter, 2 months late, with the money from Castellan's cider check arriving, the very week the bank's patience ran out. The orchard stood. How close it came that year, Silas told no one, not even Merritt, because telling her would have meant she carried it too, and he had married her to share the work and not the fear. Which brings us back to Cardew, because a thesis like Cardew's does not get tested in a kitchen. It gets tested by weather and by biology and by the one thing every model leaves out, which is the long run. For 19 years, the model worked. The ridge converted, orchard by orchard, the old standard trees dragged out by the chain and burned in pile after pile, until Silas's 40 acres were the only mixed stand left at the top of the watershed, an island of strange old varieties in a sea of identical bright trees. The chain buyer was happy. The co-op grew, built a second cold storage, bought 2 more trucks, hired a marketing man. Cardew was promoted, then promoted again, and his early planting plan was written up in a regional trade journal under a photograph of him standing in a dense block of bright fruit, and the article called "The Brindle Ridge Conversion, a Model of Cooperative Discipline." Royce Tannehill expanded twice, took on his neighbor's acres when the old man died, ran 140 acres of the single Blight cultivar, and a crew of pickers every September. By 2008, there were nearly 4,000 acres of that one apple on the ridge. All of it the same apple on the same rootstock. All of it descended by graft from a handful of original trees. All of it, in Silas's old phrase, one held breath. Now the mechanism plainly, because what fire blight is decides everything that follows. And you should understand it as biology and not as a punishment sent down on proud men. Fire blight is a bacterium. Its proper name is Erwinia amylovera, and it has lived in the apple country of North America longer than the orchards have native to the wild hawthorns and serviceberries of the continent. It overwinters in cankers, the dead sunken patches on old branches, and in the spring, when the blossoms open in warm, wet weather, the bacteria stream out of those cankers in a sweet, amber ooze, and the bees that come to the blossom carry the bacteria flower to flower as faithfully as they carry the pollen. An infected blossom blackens. The infection runs down the green shoot behind it, curling the soft tip into the exact shape of a shepherd's crook, and the leaves hang dead and scorched on the branch, as if a low fire had passed through the tree, which is where the name comes from. In a diverse old orchard, fire blight is a chronic nuisance. Some trees resist it outright. Some shrug off a strike and wall it away in a season. The damage is patchy and survivable, and a grower like Silas had been managing it by hand for 50 years, cutting out the strikes a foot below the dead wood, burning the prunings, living with the loss of a branch here and a tree there. In a monoculture of a susceptible cultivar on a susceptible rootstock, fire blight is not a nuisance. It is a fuse laid end to end across 4,000 acres. The spring of 2008 came in warm and wet, the worst possible weather for it. The blossoms opening into a run of days at 70 degrees and rain. The kind of weather that wakes the bacterium and fills the orchard with bees in the same week. The bloom was the heaviest anyone could remember. The bees were in every row. The bacterium that had been overwintering quietly in cankers all up and down the ridge woke into 4,000 acres of genetically identical, highly susceptible, densely planted blossoms with no resistant tree anywhere in all that bright uniformity to slow it down or make it pause. What happened next happened fast, faster than anyone who had not seen a monoculture fail could have believed. By the second week of June, the bright young trees on the lower ridge were burning, not with fire. With the look of fire, whole blocks gone brown at the tips, shoots curled into shepherd's crooks by the thousand, the sweet rot smell of bacterial ooze hanging over the warm rows. The disease moved tree to tree, the way it could only move through a thing that was all one thing, no genetic fire break anywhere across the planting to make it hesitate. Royce Tannehill walked his rows on a Tuesday morning and found the first strikes in his oldest block, the trees that had made his name, the ones he had planted the year he pulled out his father's standards. He cut the infected wood out the way the manual said. The cutting only spread it, blade to blade, tree to tree. Because a man cutting fire blight in wet weather carries the bacteria on his shears unless he sterilizes the steel between every single cut. No man on 140 acres could cut that fast or dip his shears that often. By Friday, the block was a write-off. Royce stood at the end of the row with the dead shears in his hand and the smell of it in the air, and could not make himself walk into the next block, because he already knew. Cardew came up the ridge that week and did not smile. He was, to his great credit, in the field at dawn every day of it, sleeves rolled past the elbow, doing the handwork himself. alongside crews who had never seen him touch a tree, and the work did not matter. The thing he had built was efficient in exactly the way that doomed it. He had selected deliberately and intelligently for uniformity. And uniformity is the very property that lets a disease move without friction. Every choice that had made the planting profitable in a good year made it indefensible in a bad one. The dense spacing that maximized the yield per acre put the trees close enough to touch, blossom against blossom, a continuous bridge for the bacteria to cross. The single cultivar the buyer wanted gave the disease one lock and one key, repeated 4,000 acres wide. And the dwarfing rootstock that brought the trees into early bearing, the M9 that was the whole economic engine of the plan, was itself highly susceptible to a form of the blight that strikes the root collar at the base of the trunk, and where it struck there, the whole tree died standing, leaves still green at the very top, killed from the ground up before the crown even knew. By the end of that summer, the ridge had lost most of a single year's crop. That alone would have been survivable. Orchards lose crops to hail and frost and drought, and live to bear again. What was not survivable was what the blight left standing in the ground behind it. The rootstock infections meant that thousands upon thousands of the dead trees were dead for good, not defoliated, but killed at the collar. And a dead M9 tree is not a setback. It is a replant. 3 more years to bearing, and the cost of the new trees and the labor to set them, and the quarterly note coming due the whole time in between, with nothing coming in to meet it. Royce Tannehill lost 90 of his 140 acres, outright killed at the root, a write-off he had borrowed against and could not now pay. Cardew's model had no line for that loss because the model's time horizon was a good decade, and biology's time horizon is a bad year inside a bad decade, and the bad year had finally, after 19 good ones, come. At the top of the ridge that summer, the 40 acres of old mixed trees stood, and that is where the verdict was quietly being written, while every other eye on the ridge was on the burning blocks below. Silas's orchard got fire blight, too. Of course it did. It had always had fire blight. He had been cutting it out by hand since he was a boy at his grandfather's elbow. The warm, wet spring struck his trees the same as everyone's, the bacteria streaming from the same cankers, the same bees carrying it into the same heavy bloom. The bright early seedlings near the road took it hard, and a few susceptible varieties he kept only for sentiment burned at the tips, like the rest of the ridge. The blight, though, hit his orchard the way a fire hits a forest of mixed age and species instead of a field of dry grass. It started in one tree and it stopped in the next, because the next tree was a different apple with a different defense, standing on a different root. The old Roxbury russets shrugged it off entirely, not a strike on them. The northern spies took a few strikes and walled them away by July. The nameless seedlings his grandfather had simply liked the look of turned out, some of them, to carry a resistance to fire blight that no breeder anywhere had ever catalogued or named, the strikes dying out at the leaf before they reached the wood, and the strip of wild understory between the rows that Silas had kept, for reasons he could not have fully explained, held a standing population of beneficial insects, and broke the humidity in a way that slowed the bacterial spread, the way a cleared firebreak slows a burn. He lost branches, he lost a handful of the susceptible trees, he did not lose the orchard. By the time the weather turned dry in mid-July and broke the bloom blight cycle, Silas Hovland had cut out his strikes by hand, the way he always had, a foot below the dead wood, dipping his shears in a coffee can of bleach between the cuts the way his grandfather taught him, burned his prunings in a small, clean pile, and stood at the end of August in an orchard that had bent and not broken, while 4,000 acres below him stood dead at the collar with their leaves still green. He did not gloat. There is no record of him saying a single word about it to anyone that whole autumn. He cut his cider wood, he sold his russets to Castellan, he packed his sign in damp sawdust, and he watched the ridge below him try to understand what had happened to it. That was the autumn the word inoculum stopped meaning what Cardew had meant by it. The reservoir of risk at the top of the watershed had turned out to be the only orchard on the ridge still standing, the only living thing up there that the Blight could not finish, and the men who had spent 19 years calling it a museum began one by one to drive up the ridge and look at it through the wire fence, with a new and uneasy expression. How the question finally got settled is its own part of the story, because it did not settle itself. And the person who answered it was not Silas and was not Cardew, but a stranger who came up the ridge with a federal badge and no interest at all in either man's feelings. The losses were severe enough that the State Extension Service and a federal agency sent in a plant pathologist to assess the disaster and recommend a path forward, because public money was going to be spent on the replanting, and somebody with the right credentials had to sign her name to how it was spent. Her name was Wren Castellan. She was the cider maker's daughter, as the ridge worked out later and made a great deal of. But she had earned her doctorate 2,000 miles from here on her own merit, and she came up the hill not as anyone's ally and not as anyone's daughter, but as an inspector with a federal mandate. She walked the dead blocks first, the lower ridge, Royce's ruined 90 acres. She took samples. She ran cultures in a borrowed lab bench at the county office and confirmed in the cold language of pathology what every grower on the ridge already knew in his stomach. Then someone at the co-op mentioned, almost as an afterthought, almost embarrassed, that there was an old orchard at the very crest of the ridge that had somehow not died, and she put her sample kit back in the car and drove up the ridge to see the anomaly with her own eyes. She spent 3 days in Silas's orchard. She did not chat. She counted. She walked every row with a notebook and a roll of flagging tape and mapped which varieties had taken strikes and which had not, tied a strip of orange tape to every tree that had walled off an infection, pulled tissue samples from the resistant seedlings and sealed them in numbered bags. She walked the wild strip between the rows and got down on her knees in it and parted the goldenrod with her hands to see what was living in there. Silas let her work and did not follow her around, and answered her questions in as few words as they could be answered in. On the morning of the 3rd day, she found him in the oldest row, at the 1911 Spitzenberg, scraping a thumbnail of bark to read the green underneath, and she asked him the only real question she had carried up the hill, and it was not about his feelings either. She asked, "How long have these seedlings been standing here, the unnamed ones?" He said, "My grandfather set to name trees in 1911. The seedlings came up on their own after that, from dropped fruit, from cores the birds carried. He let the ones he liked stand. Some of them are older than half the grafts." She looked at the tree and at the orange tape fluttering on 100 trunks down the rows, and then she said the sentence that the ridge would carry up and down its length for years, and she said it into a small recorder she held up so that it would be in the official federal assessment in her own voice and could not be argued away by anyone later. She said, "This stand contains at least 9 fire blight-resistant apple genotypes that do not appear in any catalog, collection, or breeding program, known to me in this country or in Europe, and then she gave the number. She estimated that the scion wood from those 9 resistant seedlings distributed to the public breeding programs and nurseries that would now spend the next decade trying to rebuild blight-resistant orchards across the apple country of 2 continents was worth, conservatively, between $4 and $6 million in avoided breeding costs and licensing value over the coming 20 years. $4 to $6 million. It landed on the ridge, with a force out of all proportion to the dry, careful way she said it. For 19 years, the model had measured Silas's 40 acres as a liability, an encumbrance, a museum, a reservoir of risk sitting upwind of the real money. The model had been able to see absolutely everything about that orchard except the one thing that turned out to matter, which was that a place holding many different living things holds, somewhere down in it, the answer to a question that nobody has thought to ask yet. To the co-op's ledger, it had been worthless ground at the top of a hill. To the bank, it had been an encumbrance on the collateral. To the chain buyer, it had been 40 acres of apples he could never put a sticker on. To the future, it turned out it was the only thing on the whole Bright Ridge worth saving. What happened to Cardew is the test of this story, because the niche of it is not cruelty and a sincere wrong man is owed a fair accounting. Cardew did not lose his job, though he offered to resign, and the co-op did not let him, because he was, even after all of it, the most capable man they had and the only one who could lead the rebuilding. What he lost was the smile. He came up the ridge alone, one gray morning the next spring before the bloom, and found Silas pruning in the cold with his breath showing. He did not bring a form this time, and he did not bring the machine. He stood at the end of the row in his clean coat, with his hands in his pockets, and watched the old man work for a while, the shears going, the cut wood dropping, and then he said plainly, with no motto behind him and no room of growers to perform for, "I was sure I was right." Silas did not stop pruning. He made one more cut, a clean one, and let the wood fall. And he said, "You were right about the market. You were wrong about the years that came after. They are not the same thing, and a man can be both." Cardew took that for a long moment, standing there in the cold. Then he asked the question that turned him from a doubter into a student, which is the only ending this kind of story is allowed to have. He asked, "Will you teach me how you kept them alive?" And Silas, who had refused this man for 19 years, came down off the ladder rung by rung and set his shears on the top step and looked at him and said, "Get a notebook. It takes longer than one morning." What came after is the half of the story that matters most, because a vindication that ends at the number is only half a vindication, and the half that counts is what the man chose to do with being right. He could have sold the scion wood of those 9 seedlings to the highest bidder and kept the resistance to himself, licensed it tree by tree, made the fortune Ren Castellan's number plainly implied was sitting in his oldest rows. He did not. He gave the cuttings to the public breeding program for the bare cost of the postage, on one written condition, which was that the resulting trees be released unpatented and free, available to any grower anywhere to plant, the way his grandfather's seedlings had been free to come up on their own out of dropped fruit. He kept enough scion back to graft a new diverse block at the top of his own ridge, and he taught Cardew, over the better part of 2 years, the unglamorous mechanism of the thing, which was never a secret, and never had been, and could be said in 5 plain sentences. Plant many different things. Keep the old ones even when they pay badly. Leave the wild strips standing between the rows. Watch the trees instead of the model. Do not bet the whole ridge on a single held breath. Royce Tannehill replanted his ruined 90 acres in a mixed block of a dozen varieties, several of them grafted from Silas's resistant seedlings, and he left a strip of wild understory standing between every row, unmown past June, and he came up the ridge in the autumn of 2012 to tell the old man so. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands the way he had in 1997, but the words he had come to say were different ones. "I pulled out my father's standard trees with a chain," he said, "and I burned them in a pile you could see from town. I was 20 years burning that pile, and I think about it every spring when the bloom comes on." Silas poured him coffee, the same as always, and he did not say, "I told you so," because he never had told him so. Not in those words, not in that meeting in 1989, and not in the kitchen in 1997, and not once in all the years between. He had only stood his ground and let the long run carry the argument for him. That was the whole of his method, in the field and at the kitchen table both, and it was the same method. The co-op survived, smaller and slower and far more various, and it took Silas back as a full member and priced his cold storage at the regular rate, and never once mentioned the back fees. And Cardew, with his new notebook full of an old man's plain sentences, saw to it that the rebuilt co-op planting standard required a minimum number of cultivars in every member orchard, a resistant rootstock trial in every new block, and a strip of unmown ground left standing between the rows, written into the bylaws in language that an old orchardist could have dictated, and very nearly did. Marit lived to see the new block bloom. She stood at the edge of it the first spring it flowered, the 9 resistant seedlings grafted high onto fresh young trunks, and the wild strip already greening between the rows, the bees working it in the warm light. And she said to her husband the longest sentence she had said to him about the orchard in 30 years. She said, "Your grandfather would have looked at this and called it an ordinary orchard." And Silas, watching the bees, said he would have. That was the whole idea. And that was the end of the conversation, the way their conversations had always ended, with the important thing left sitting plainly in the air between them where it did not need to be said out loud. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this story, and it is worth naming them plainly at the close, because the whole long argument of the ridge came down in the end to the difference between them. There is the kind that is wide and shallow and confident, that can model 4,000 acres and a decade of markets and be right about very nearly all of it. And there is the kind that is narrow and deep and patient, that knows one particular 40 acres at the top of one particular cold shoulder of a ridge, well enough to know what it is holding before anyone on earth has thought to ask. Cardew had the first kind, and it was real knowledge, and it built a great deal, and it was never foolish. Silas had the second kind, and for 19 years it looked like nothing at all but stubbornness and an old man's love for trees that would not pay their own keep. The market rewarded the first kind for almost 20 years running. The long run rewarded the second kind in a single warm, wet spring, all at once and in full, the way time always pays a patient man, which is late, and which is completely. He kept pruning into his 80s, the bad thumb worse, but the eye for a lying trunk undimmed. The orchard outlived him, as he had always meant it to. The 9 resistant seedlings grafted now into orchards in a dozen states, and across 2 countries, growing free and unpatented and unstickered, the standing answer to a question the future had finally gotten around to asking. The co-op set a small plaque at the top of the ridge after he was gone, and his granddaughter, Nora, who had read Ren Castellan's assessment as a girl and become a plant pathologist herself because of it, would tell you the plaque got it slightly wrong. It called him a pioneer. He was the opposite of a pioneer. He was a man who refused to plow under what was already standing there, who kept the old trees through every year they cost him, and every careful man who told him to clear them, and who turned out, in the end, to have been holding the one thing on the whole Bright Ridge that could not be bought back or grafted up or replanted once it was gone. What is rigid breaks? What is? Various endures. The most valuable thing on that whole uniform bridge turned out to be the 40 acres the model could not count, standing green at the top of the watershed in a spring when everything beneath it had burned, holding its breath no longer, having never once in 100 years held it at all.